Being American is unique in so many ways. I have nearly no connection to my ethnic roots. My ethnicity means almost nothing anyway. My parents' DNA map confirms, yes, I am white, but there's really no region of Europe my ancestors didn't come from. For much of the world, this isn't the case, although this experience is hardly homogenous in America. Most of my favorite bands, movies, and TV shows are all American. They're from my country, save for some countries with big media production and engines like Brazil or India or Nigeria. The top chart rankers in almost every country are filled with American hits. My level of income and those around me seems normal. The poor people around me seem poor. The rich people at the fancy cocktail bar seem rich. Maybe that feeling is universal. But I've never met a globally poor person in America. In per capita income, America is number 6 in the world. The few countries above us are all small. The global median per capita income is $2,920 per year. An unskilled and unlucky panhandler in America makes more than that. My world has incredible stability. The U.S. is the richest empire in human history. Our military is multiple times more powerful than the second best. Save for the threat of nuclear weapons, there is no existential military threat to my country. We're geographically impervious. And economically, we've been on top for 130 years. This is a level of existential protection that most people will never have. In short, it's hard to understand places like the region we'll be traveling to today, among the world's truly poorest. The poorest country I've been to, the Philippines, median income about $1,600 per year, was an economic paradise compared to Somaliland. Somalilanders have strong familial clan roots, yet belong to a country that's hardly a country at all. It's relatively stable, but relative to a country most famous for pirates and terrorists. The first country that comes to mind when you think of anarchy, in the bad way, not the brooding book club at the coffee shop kind of way. To live in a place that's not recognized is foreign. The impacts on daily life are abstract. The difference in one's sense of identity must be profound. All this to say that trying to understand Somaliland should be deeply edifying. I'm thrilled, therefore, to present a lecture on an incredible topic. Hats off to the wording committee, and I hope you enjoy learning about it and debating it as much as I've enjoyed the research. Two quick things before we begin. First, all evidence cited can be found at Debatetrack.com. Your subscription fee keeps these lectures free, and buying a brief is the best way to support this channel. Thank you for supporting Debatetrack and for fueling accessible debate. Number two, all evidence cited here and the quotes I read are cut. The same way as in debate rounds, they're not read verbatim. We'll begin this argument with background, then affirmative arguments, and then end with negative arguments. So first, on background. Here is your resolution. The African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. Let's briefly touch on the key terms. Somaliland is a territory in the Horn of Africa comprising the northwest corner of the country of Somalia. The African Union, abbreviated AU, is a federation of 55 member states that represents the interests of Africa, a kind of UN for the African continent. Diplomatic recognition is a formal, official recognition that Somaliland is a country. What this means is that it would be officially a separate country from Somalia, at least according to the African Union, under the terms of this resolution. Now, for an in-depth look at the star of the show herself, Somaliland. First, the name. Don't confuse it with Swaziland, which doesn't exist anymore anyway, thankfully, or with Switzerland, the reason that Swaziland no longer exists. Say it with me, Somaliland. Somaliland is located in the Horn of Africa, so called because it kind of looks like a horn, I suppose. It's bordered by Ethiopia, Djibouti, easily the funniest country name, and of course, Somalia. Note that Sudan, Egypt, and Yemen are all nearby. Foreshadowing. Somaliland lies on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Gate of Tears. From Wikipedia, quote, The strait derives its name from the dangers attending its navigation, or according to an Arab legend, from the numbers who were drowned by an earthquake that separated the Arabian Peninsula from the Horn of Africa. The strait is a geopolitically highly strategic location. Quote, "The location of Somaliland in the Horn of Africa lends its strategic importance along with economic appeal. It is situated at the entrance to the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, through which a third of the world's maritime cargo is shipped." That's Gordon 23. And that is why this question is important. The recognition or not of Somaliland may affect a great many countries. Quote, "A strategic location has broadened the significance of Somaliland in regional security and economics. A bid for recognition touches on powerful regional and international interest." That is Idan 14. One of my many strange hobbies is leaving funny reviews on Google Maps locations in the world's most remote locations, like northern Greenland. Here is my 5-star review for the Odiojarbis fuel station in Somaliland's Garbo Darad district. I encourage you to click around Somaliland and leave an absurd 5-star review yourself. Somaliland, the history. Much like every square inch of Africa, to one degree or another, Ethiopia perhaps excluded, Somaliland was colonized by European powers. To simplify things a bit, Somaliland was colonized by the British and Somalia by Italy. Both gained independence from their respective colonial powers in 1960, and 5 days after Somalia's independence, the two voluntarily merged to form the Republic of Somaliland. However, tensions simmered between the two sides until an explosion that led to Somaliland's separation from the Republic. Matthew Gordon is currently completing his doctorate in politics and international studies and has a decade of experience working on Somaliland and Somalia. He sums up this history in Gordon 23, quote, "Certain out-of-favor clans, such as the Isaaq that makes up the majority of today's Somaliland, found themselves marginalized and oppressed under the Somalian Republic's increasingly authoritarian dictatorship. Organized attempts to resist these conditions were met with a centrally directed campaign of extermination. Between 50,000 and 100,000 civilians were massacred, and entire cities in Somaliland were reduced to rubble." End quote. This war of independence lasted for 10 years, from 1981 to 91, when Somaliland gained independence. Since then, Somaliland has remained a de facto state. Somaliland has also since then nurtured a democratic, stable, and relatively peaceful state. Somalia, in the meantime, devolved into one of the most infamously dangerous and war-torn countries in the world. Any visits by foreigners require hiring a retinue of armed guards and armored vehicles to accompany you. The famous film Black Hawk Down, about the downing of American choppers in the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu, added to that infamy. Somaliland, Somalia, and much of rural and pastoral Africa is politically organized based on clans, large extended families that form the basis of social organization, governance, and identity. And by a large family here, I mean like hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals, not like you've got a big Catholic family large. These are clans, not really families. Most clans have a particular territory that they traditionally inhabit and control. Territorial claims often overlap with state boundaries or administrative regions, leading to interactions and sometimes tensions between clan governance and state governance. Now, Somaliland's politics, the key point of this resolution. Somaliland is a presidential democratic republic based in the capital Hargeisa. Pictured here, for example, are people waiting in line to vote. If you go down the Somaliland Wikipedia rabbit hole, please steer clear of the capital city's flag. Nothing to see here. It's boring, you'll fall asleep. Hargeisa has representative offices or consulates from a number of countries, including Djibouti, Ethiopia, Turkey, the UK, Denmark, Kenya, UAE, and Taiwan. Likewise, Somaliland has representative offices in a group of countries around the world, including Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Turkey, UAE, US, Canada, Australia, and a number of European countries. These representative offices you could call de facto consulates or de facto embassies. They can't be called embassies really because Somaliland is not a country really, but that is in effect what they are. Despite this obvious diplomacy at work around the world, no countries officially recognize Somaliland. This is despite the fact that Somaliland has tried to gain recognition since its informal independence in 1991. Now, I have found sources that claim that Ethiopia, UAE, Somalia, or indeed all countries in the African Union already recognize Somaliland. Do not believe these lies, or at least recognize that recognition might mean different things to different people in different contexts. The one exception to this is Taiwan, which does recognize Somaliland, but which, as you know, is in a sort of political limbo. So it doesn't necessarily count. Puntland is an autonomous region in northeastern Somaliland, but much like Somaliland, has an independent governance structure and relative stability. But unlike Somaliland, hasn't made a bid for independence. It doesn't really want to. As a region, it is tied to Mogadishu, to the Somalian government. Although Puntland lies within Somalia's claimed borders, there's some overlap with Somalia's claimed borders, leading to conflict in the overlapping regions of Sul, Sanag, and Kane, known as the SSC Kadumo region, which is roughly the disputed area that you can see on the map here, although not exactly. If this seems confusing, it's because it is confusing. The most recent of these clashes was the Lasanad conflict in the capital of the Sul region, where Somalia's government sought to crack down on protests and subdue the region with heavy artillery bombardment. In the end, SSC militias won and Somaliland's military was forced to retreat. This embarrassing loss for Somaliland may be a big reason why its people decided to elect a new president last month on November 14th. Somalia, for its part, is not on board with an independent Somaliland and maintains the One Somalia policy. Does that sound familiar? Under which it claimed control of the entirety of official Somalia, including Somaliland. Somalia asks and requires many countries to assent or acknowledge this policy in order to maintain good relations with Mogadishu. If a country were to officially recognize Somaliland, decent chance Mogadishu would cut ties with them in some way or launch some major protest against the nation. However, Somalia's weak government, internal conflict, and widespread poverty and corruption mean that the government can hardly lay claim even to Somalia itself, much less areas like Puntland and Somaliland. Quote from Company 21, "Despite international approval among Somalis, the state does not have legitimacy. The government's power simply extends to that of Mogadishu, and even within the capital, power is relative." End quote. Ethiopia is Africa's second most populous country and one of the region's most powerful, despite being completely landlocked. The Blue Nile, the major tributary of the Nile River that flows through Egypt, originates in Ethiopia. Egypt, however, claims rights to all of the Nile's river water based on agreements signed with colonial powers in Sudan. Ethiopia, who is never part of these agreements, rejects them as invalid. Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, is a large hydroelectric dam, the largest in Africa, built on this river, which aims to give Ethiopia energy independence. So I know this is a big change of pace, but Ethiopia, big country in Africa, completely landlocked, controls the source of Egypt's river. Egypt lays claim to all of that water. Ethiopia says, no, it's kind of ours. We're going to make a big dam. With 90% of Egypt's fresh water coming from the Nile, this water flow is a national security concern for the country. With Ethiopia rising regional power, this dam is a tangible symbol of Ethiopia's enormous leverage over Egypt's literal lifeline. Sudan, meanwhile, is in the middle of the two, both literally and of course and figuratively, sometimes siding with Egypt and sometimes with Ethiopia. While Sudan does share some of the same concerns over water control that Egypt does, they also stand to benefit from the regular water flows and cheap electricity stemming from Ethiopia's new dam. A couple of other benefits like silt control on the river. So they aren't not really opposed to it like Egypt is. Ethiopia, by the way, is landlocked. A significant issue for such a powerful country. Most of Ethiopia's trade, about 95%, goes through Djibouti. This is a stable relationship, but Djibouti charges port fees and tariffs on goods. Alternate port access would therefore be extremely valuable. Ethiopia did have port access until 1993, when Eritrea seceded from the country along with its coastline. Given this history, Ethiopia's use of Eritrean ports is limited. There is a lot of tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Okay, let us bring all of this back together in Somaliland, which is what we were really trying to talk about. Ethiopia wants to build a port in Somaliland for sea access so that it is no longer landlocked. At the port city of Berbera, they also want a port for trade, but perhaps also for their military, which again is expanding as the country gains more and more influence. Somaliland wants official recognition from its first country, Ethiopia. Egypt wants to stop Ethiopia from expanding its powers in the region, and therefore Egypt supports Somalia's central government. Michael Rubin, not to be confused with the American businessman, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, PhD in history, Yale University. He's an excellent and prolific writer, in fact suspiciously so, and therefore makes many appearances in the Debatetrack brief. This is an uncut op-ed from Egypt's Somalia Gamble. Quote, Egypt has no beef with Somaliland and no real interest in Somalia itself, but sees opportunity in the Ethiopia-Somalia dispute. As the adage goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. By arming Somalia, Egypt likely figures it can annoy Ethiopia and perhaps even stop its drive to the sea. By providing the Somali government with weapons, absent any controls, the Egyptian government essentially opens the floodgates. I've interviewed captured insurgents in both northern Mozambique and the DRC. Each talked of Somalia's al-Shabaab running weapons smuggling routes, end quote. Where might these smuggling routes for Egyptian weapons go to? Rubin goes on to mention al-Shabaab smuggling weapons to Sudan, the world's bloodiest conflict. But also indicated on the smuggling route for al-Shabaab's weapons, Ethiopia. So, Egypt does not want Ethiopia to do well. Therefore, it gives weapons to Somalia. Some of these weapons are making its way to Ethiopia, to people fighting against the government, not to the Ethiopian government itself. In January 2024, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU. Somaliland would give Ethiopia port access, and in exchange, Ethiopia would recognize Somaliland officially. A stake in Ethiopian Airlines was also promised to Ethiopia. This MOU has not been published, nor has it been ratified, and therefore isn't yet legally binding. But already, regional actors are up in arms about what it might mean for them. This MOU will form the basis of much of NEG's arguments. If a simple MOU, a preliminary announcement, causes enormous unrest, instability, and consternation in the region, how much more of an impact will formal recognition by the African Union have on regional stability? This is a question. Next actor, we've mentioned them. Al-Shabaab is an Islamist militant group based in Somalia, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and known for its violent insurgency and efforts to establish strict Islamic rule in the region. Their stated goal is to overthrow the Somali government and establish an Islamic state under their strict interpretation of Sharia law. I think this is important to not downplaying radical Islamism groups because you feel some misplaced sympathy for them. You can both be an underdog and even oppressed, perhaps, and even have the most horrible imaginable situation in the world happening to you, and at the same time be extremely violently wrong. Hamas, for example, is not a political group that sometimes attacks Israel. Their whole mission, at the expense of perhaps simplifying things, is attacking Israel. If you were to sum it up succinctly, that's what they do. Likewise, al-Shabaab's entire purpose is overthrowing the Somali government and establishing a strict Islamic state and warring jihad. These aren't hobbies or things it does incidentally, things on the side, routes to its political mission. These are the actual purposes for the group's existence. Think like a small half a step down from ISIS. In 2012, al-Shabaab pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda, aligning itself with the global jihadist movement. They have targeted attacks on government forces, African Union troops, and civilians, including in Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. Al-Shabaab, operating in Somalia, has a geographically important perch. Again, 1/3 of global shipping passes through the region, and recently contacts have been confirmed with the Houthis, a group with similar aims in Yemen across the Gulf of Aden. And may I say, these guys got drip. Joel, you can't say that. You can't say terrorists have drip. You're going to get fired. Okay, next, African Union. Africa's governing body, a group of 55 member states. This includes all 54 African countries plus Western Sahara, another one of Africa's ambiguous states. The AU currently has 49 active members, as 6 have been suspended from membership due to military coups, which are very common in Africa. A brief aside on military coups in Africa. Colonial powers ran African countries as military dictatorships. And given that those militarized bureaucracies were left behind when the colonial powers left, these countries' militaries often have outsized political power, combined with the other ravages of colonialism like resource exploitation, weak systems, arbitrary borders, and the killing of pre-colonial government systems. The end result is that military coups are now shockingly common, with 45 successful coups since 2000, and 9 of those between 2020 and 2023 alone. Maybe things will settle out eventually. Maybe, but not yet, because it's not like colonialism was a long time ago. Somaliland, for example, gained independence in 1960. As Joe Rogan will put it, that was one person ago. That was yesterday. Back to the African Union. Votes on various matters are determined through a simple majority, or in the case of recognizing a country, a 2/3 vote. In practice, consensus in the AU is highly valued, so unless a near unanimous decision could be reached, the matter is unlikely to be voted on. However, in theory, countries like Egypt and Somalia wouldn't need to follow suit. The African Union could vote to recognize Somaliland in spite of the opposition of some of its states. In this unstable and strategically valuable region, there are other countries that have influence or desire for influence over Somaliland. South Africa has been a longtime supporter of Somaliland, diplomatically and institutionally, for example, lending expertise in fighting terrorists. The country would certainly, like Ethiopia, be a supporter in Somaliland's bid for recognition if it came to a vote. Turkey is in the middle of the world, both geographically and geopolitically, for example, acting as a political middleman between NATO and Russia. And so it is with this conflict. Turkey is allied with Ethiopia and has lobbied for the Ethiopian-Somaliland deal, but is also friends with Somalia. In fact, after the announcement of the Ethiopian MOU, Somalia signed a sweeping defense and development agreement with Turkey that aims to build and train the Somali Navy while giving Turkey permission to patrol Somalia's coastal waters. It's speculated this was a direct response to the MOU, but it is hard to know exactly. Although this agreement includes Somaliland's waters, because after all, according to Somalia, those are its waters, Hargeisa has told Turkey that they are not welcome to patrol its shores. This picture, for clarification, is Erdogan and Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, leader of Somalia, not Somaliland, but boy, do they look like buds, huh? You know, when you see like a political gathering and there's a bunch of photographers everywhere around in a semicircle or a big bunch, and you think, geez, that's overkill. Like maybe they could have 2 photographers or something. Why do they need, it seems like 7 from every network? Well, sometimes it's not. And Somaliland needs more of those. So if you are like looking to make your mark on the world of political photography, you know where to go. I couldn't find a nice Turkey Somaliland picture because they don't have enough photographers. The UAE is a significant commercial partner with Somaliland, including developing and running the major port of Berbera. They've invested in infrastructure in the country, like the Berbera Corridor, a series of roads and railroads linking Ethiopia and the port. The Emiratis have also developed military infrastructure at the port, and after long talk of development, lots of controversy and deals being proposed and shelved, satellite imagery has recently confirmed that military infrastructure construction has begun in Somaliland. Israel, recently on the offensive against regional threats, has also taken interest in Somaliland as a base for fighting the Houthis, who, despite being far from Israel, have launched several successful attacks on the country. Quote, Israel is interested in establishing a military base in northern Somalia in order to keep tabs on Yemen. According to the report, Israel seeks to enhance its national security from afar and challenge the Houthis' presence in Yemen, along with other potential economic opportunities that could be spurred from diplomatic relations. End quote. That is Jerusalem Post, 10/24. Of course, other countries have an interest in the region as well. US, China, Russia, and others all have some interest in Somaliland, especially as its ambiguous state opens the door for gaining some advantage in the situation. In fact, this is something I'm not going over at all, but is mentioned, is the sort of US-China rivalry in Africa manifested in Somaliland. Something I'm not covering at all here, but that does exist. For more reading on the roles of various countries in the region, I recommend the Feldman 24 article entitled All Eyes on Somaliland, the tiny African state that's key to Israel's war on Houthi terror. And now, we affirm. The AU has a mandate, a responsibility, and even an obligation to recognize the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. As a de facto state fitting all the international and common sense requirements for statehood, recognition will just acknowledge facts on the ground, that Somalia is a state and has been for over 30 years. Economically, recognition will help both Somalilanders and the Horn of Africa region, and militarily, recognition will help in the fight against piracy, Al-Shabaab, and the Houthis, all of whom are threats to international trade and stability. First, why should the AU specifically recognize Somaliland? Why not the EU or the UN or individual countries like Ethiopia or Australia? The AU, as Africa's governing body, has a mandate to recognize countries within its purview, much as it's recognized Eritrea and South Sudan when they split from their mother countries of Ethiopia and Sudan, respectively. Stephen Schwartz is former ambassador from the U.S. to Somalia. He says, quote, "The African Union has the mandate to mediate peace and make determinations on sovereignty. It can compel Somalia to negotiate or decide itself whether to accept Somaliland's demands for its sovereignty to be restored." End quote. In contrast, foreign nations, and especially Western nations, don't want to be the first to recognize Somaliland as an independent state. Such a move could be seen as meddling in African affairs, or at worst, a kind of neo-colonialism. Perhaps it's the case, then, that the AU's inaction on Somalia is itself a kind of action. Perhaps they don't recognize Somaliland's statehood because it doesn't quite fit the AU's rules for statehood. However, the main criteria the AU uses in a bid to preserve some stability on a wildly unstable continent is sticking to colonial borders, the borders that were set out a country's independence and its permanent legal borders. However, Somaliland also fits this guideline with the same borders it had when it gained independence in 1960. Here's Pelt 16 quoting Somaliland's foreign ministry, quote, "Somaliland is a reality. It fulfills all the requirements of a foreign state as in full compliance with Article 4 of the AU Charter regarding the preservation of inherited colonial boundaries." It should come as no surprise, then, the AU fact-finding mission sent in 2005 to determine Somaliland's legitimacy for statehood came away with a resounding answer for statehood. Yes, Somaliland is a state and should be recognized by the AU. Again, Schwartz 21, quote, "The AU took up the issue in 2005 by sending a fact-finding mission to Somaliland. The official summary of its findings is very favorable towards Somaliland's claims, asserting Somaliland's search for recognition is historically unique and self-justified in African political history." End quote. Now, this lack of recognition isn't just an oversight or a decision stuck in bureaucracy. The AU's inaction on the matter causes real harm, and it's harm that the AU alone has the responsibility to mend by recognizing Somaliland. Nikola Piovic, we've already seen him a couple times, is a PhD scholar with the National Security College, Australian National University. His PhD focuses on Australian relations towards Africa and the African continent. Quote, "The AU has failed to deal constructively with the Somaliland question and shoulders much of the blame for the country's international isolation. If one had to use a single phrase to characterize the AU's position towards Somaliland, it would be bipolar. The mixed signals the AU has been sending Somaliland leaders in the past 10 years are indicative of its bipolar personality. The AU has so far failed to rise to the challenge, preferring a Somaliland left in international limbo to an organization torn by such an emotive issue. The AU has repeatedly failed to come to terms with events on the ground in Somalia." End quote. Some go even further, adding that the AU not only has a mandate and a responsibility, but a moral obligation to recognize Somaliland. For them, recognition is a way to make whole the people of Somaliland who suffered through immense brutality under the Somaliland government during their time as a unified country. Again, restating Gordon 23 from the intro, quote, "These appeals to a legal right to self-determination dovetail with a moral one. The right for a people suffering under the yoke of domination and genocidal violence to be freed from their oppressors. During the civil war, between 50,000 and 100,000 civilians were massacred and entire cities of Somaliland were reduced to rubble. For Somalilanders who lived through such dark times, the declaration of a Somaliland Republic in 1991 was a moment of liberation, not solely from a particular regime, but from the totality of the political arrangement that had countenanced their victimization. End quote. But the impacts of AU recognition won't stick to the AU. The AU indeed has a unique mandate and responsibility to recognize Somaliland, but after its recognition, other countries will follow suit. Rubin 23, quote, Ethiopian diplomats have always quipped that they would not be the first country to recognize Somaliland, but they would not be the third either. End quote. There have been calls for other countries, including Australia and the US, to recognize as well. In that context, Rubin 24 says, expect a cascade of recognition. Once the AU pulls the trigger, the ball will start rolling. The AU is the linchpin in Somaliland's quest for international legitimacy. The AU must act. And save for this lack of recognition that we're talking about, Somaliland does have legitimacy in spades. Perhaps the most legitimate definition of statehood is possession of accoutrements of a nation. By analogy, if I own a baseball glove and a baseball bat and hang out at baseball fields a lot with baseball players and I'm known to play baseball on the weekends, you might think, hey, maybe that guy's a baseball player. Likewise, if a place has all the things a country has and does all the things a country does, then hey, it might just be a country. Something duck. Somaliland has its own constitution. It issues passports. It prints currency usable in its territory. It maintains an army that defends its borders. And unlike Somalia, it holds regular, direct elections. These are the things countries do and have. But perhaps I'm being arbitrary with my definitions. Maybe statehood is more than making your own passports and printing your own money. Let's turn instead to the international definition of statehood, the Montevideo Convention. Temesgen Bien is an is an assistant professor in comparative constitutional law at Bahir Dar University School of Law in Ethiopia. He addresses this question. The question now is whether Somaliland fulfills the requirement of the state under international law or not. The criteria to fulfill statehood are provided under the Montevideo Convention. The Montevideo Convention lists 4 basic elements required for statehood: a permanent population, a defined territory, government, and a capacity to enter into relations with other states. The Montevideo standards are fulfilled by Somaliland through the international community frustrates to accept this real and bitter truth. End quote. So, by both informal and formal criteria, Somaliland is, in fact, a country. One of Montevideo's criteria, again, is the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Like other countries, Somaliland maintains diplomatic relations with other states, including representative offices in various countries. That makes deals, both military and economic, with other nations, as we've already mentioned with, for example, Turkey. As we've noted, countries like the US and UAE regularly do business in the country. And of course, Ethiopia is of special note here. Again, Piavik 13. Ethiopia currently stands as the most strategic and perhaps most sympathetic African actor in Somaliland's recognition bid. This close bilateral and diplomatic relationship is a strong boost for Somaliland's recognition aspirations, especially as Ethiopia is an important AU member and regional power. And South Africa. Quote, of the African states and not neighboring Somaliland, South Africa has emerged as the main state willing to entertain Somaliland's case for international recognition. A legal brief published by the state found it is undeniable that Somaliland does indeed qualify for statehood, and it is incumbent upon the international community to recognize it. End quote. Pictured here, the Somaliland de facto ambassador to the US. Again, everything is kind of de facto, but look, it's a de facto state. Somaliland, if recognized, would hardly be the first new country to be recognized by the AU, even recently. The Gambia separated from Senegal in 1982, Eritrea from Ethiopia in 1993, South Sudan from Sudan in 2011. Yet, quoting Rubin 23, compared to both Eritrea and South Sudan, which split from larger nations, Somaliland has a deeper claim to renewed independence. End quote. Would it be wrong for the AU to recognize a territory that isn't universally recognized? No. In fact, it currently does so, recognizing Western Sahara as an independent state, despite Morocco claiming it as its southern territories, much as Somalia might refer to Somaliland as its northern territories. Even if this precedent hadn't been so well set, thus further reinforcing Somaliland's legitimacy, this country is a unique case that should be judged on its own merits. Quote, Somaliland has been steadily laying the foundation of a democratic modern state. The AU should be disposed to judge the case of Somaliland from an objective historical viewpoint and a moral angle vis-a-vis the aspirations of its people. End quote. Again, tripping. Finally, Somaliland is a democratic country with stable state institutions, thus holding legitimacy in the eyes of its own people, who choose their own leaders. While the AU doesn't explicitly value one form of government or another, Somaliland's resultant stability, especially compared to Somalia, mesh with the AU's values. Quote, Companion 21. International recognition in Somaliland has translated to legitimacy. Thus, in the eyes of the Somaliland people, the de facto state is legitimate. Somaliland is an extraordinary success story, unparalleled in the world in its achievements in democracy, rule of law, peace, and human rights. End quote. Somaliland actively guards civil liberties, maintains free and independent media, and has healthy, active civil organizations. These are all hallmarks of the types of healthy and stable democracies that the AU must promote through recognition. Okay, now we've shown that Somaliland should be recognized and that the AU should be the one to do it. Now, for some impacts, if not terminal, at least downstream, we'll group these into two buckets. First, Somaliland herself and the lives of her 6.2 million people. Second, the Horn of Africa region, and then the international community beyond. Somaliland is poor, but recognition will help. Somaliland's GDP is $7.5 billion. That's about 10 times smaller than the GDP of my Midwest mid-sized city of Grand Rapids, or 35 times smaller than San Francisco's. The government operates on about $250 million per year, about 3 times less than Grand Rapids runs on, and about 60% of that budget goes to policing and security, a large focus for a territory that prides itself on peace and stability. Remittances make up a significant portion of its GDP, about $500 million per year, and much of the rest of its economy comes from livestock, sheep, cattle, camels, making up 70% of employment. Some industry, like a Coca-Cola bottling plant, also operate in Somaliland. A note on remittances: some sources say that the majority or the lifeline of the country composed of remittances, in fact, is about 6%. Nothing to shake your head at, but not the lifeline of the country. It's not one of the higher countries like Tonga or Lebanon, for example, with remittances that make up over 30% of their GDP. Overall, unemployment runs wildly high at about 75%. According to the Wikipedia list, this would put Somaliland 25% higher than the number one spot, Sudan, if it were counted on the list. So, in other words, the world's highest unemployment, as far as I can tell, by an absurdly high margin. In international terms, even Somaliland's limited economic activity is difficult to conduct with other countries, as the Somaliland shilling can't be converted on international monetary markets. These markets can't be accessed at the currency level, neither can they be accessed at the government level. Ferragamo and Klabusta 18 quote, "The government is ineligible for loans from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as long as Somaliland is not an internationally recognized state or reconciled with Somalia." End quote. Economically, therefore, Somalia is screwed on every level. However, recognition can help. James Jeffrey is a freelance journalist focusing on migration with a specialty on the Horn of Africa. Quote, "Somalilanders believe recognition would bring a raft of benefits. The government, for starters, would finally have legitimacy to borrow international money to enhance basic services such as electricity, gas, water, and rubbish collection, and to fund state schools, universities, and hospitals needed around the country." End quote. This will be a focus for the new administration, who sees recognition and economic fortunes as inexorably tied. Lonen 224, quote, "Somaliland's new president will simultaneously seek foreign investment and seek international recognition," end quote. In the short term, local industries like camel milk farming will benefit. The Economist 24 has a great piece on just this fact. Long term, the benefits of recognizing a stable democracy in a largely unstable region are hard to imagine, because the benefits of recognizing Somaliland will not stop at its borders. The economic benefits we have just talked about won't stay confined to Somaliland. Shire 17, quote, international recognition will only accelerate the pace of Somaliland's private sector growth with positive knock-on effects for the wider region, end quote. The main regional and international benefit, however, is stability, which economic growth certainly dovetails with. The Horn of Africa is unstable, and Somaliland remains a stable oasis within this democracy desert. Recognizing Somaliland could provide a framework of stability for the region while establishing the African Union as the bringer of that stability. Dr. Guy Chol-Paul is an academic professor and researcher and the chairman of the People's United Forum. Quote, the people of Somaliland deserve to have their nation recognized by the African Union and given the same rights and recognition as other African nations. We believe that recognizing Somaliland will not only provide a stable framework for the entire region, but will also enhance the reputation of the AU as an organization dedicated to promoting peace and development, end quote. Ban 19 adds another angle, noting that the ambiguous one Somalia, two Somalia system adds uncertainty to the calculus of everyone in the neighborhood. Quote, the recognition of Somaliland by other states will have its own significance to abort the illusionary plan of Great Somalia and to bring sustainable peace and security in the neighboring Djibouti, Kenya, and Ethiopia, as they are also victims of such illusionary plan, end quote. Next, a couple of examples of what stability actually means. Pirates are perhaps Somalia's most famous export, and was a major issue in the 2000s. Since then, it has declined significantly. However, Somali piracy is back on the rise. Mahmoud 624 reports that, quote, Somali pirates have been implicated in more than 30 buccaneering incidents since November 2023, end quote. And this is no small issue. At its peak, Somali piracy cost the global economy up to $10 billion per year. For a start, Somaliland is less prone to piracy and extremism than neighboring Somalia. Gordon 23. Deeply rooted peace and democratic legitimacy has protected Somaliland from vulnerability to terror and piracy by promoting cooperation between communities and authorities and rooting out potential threats, end quote. Rewarding, supporting, and recognizing this piracy haven is the least the AU can do in preventing the spread of piracy. But recognition can actually help to actively fight piracy as well. Somaliland's lack of international recognition poses major challenges to its involvement, but with a stable economy, Somaliland would be able to devote far more resources to combating piracy. That is Roach 11. But what's worse than pirates? If you guessed, violent, religious extremism, you'd be right. As you'll recall from the introduction, Al-Shabaab is a bunch of bad dudes whose stated organizational goal is overthrowing the Somali government to form an Islamic theocracy from which to continue global jihad. And Somaliland is a perfect base to fight Al-Shabaab from. It neighbors Somalia, is a stable democracy, and is aligned with the West. Here's Ruben 24. The intelligence community sees Somaliland as a stable base from which to monitor Yemeni weapons smugglers and Al-Shabaab terrorists. The U.S. should recognize Somaliland within minutes of Ethiopia. If the Pentagon stations helicopters and Bell Boeing V-22 Ospreys at Berbera, it can secure freedom of navigation more quickly and at lower cost. Somaliland is a solution, not the problem. For both groups, pirates and especially Al-Shabaab, a lack of recognition for Somaliland and its accompanying sky-high unemployment creates a fragile situation that could be exploited by criminal groups. Here is Jeffrey 16. Young men are a ready-made pool of rudderless youth from which militant extremists with an agenda can recruit. Unquote. Although Somaliland has remained stable, this stability is hardly guaranteed. Official recognition would be one way to ensure it remains the Horn's stable oasis of peace. Although the Houthis, based out of Yemen, are less radically ideological than Al-Shabaab, their tactics have been far more damaging to global transit than anything Somalia has lobbed at the ocean. But the two groups share an important commonality. Both operate near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. However, again, recognition solves. The Ethiopian military has proposed by the MOU could be used to fight both the Houthis and Somalian pirates, according to the Maritime Exclusive, 24. And Israel, apparently on a quest to reformat the entirety of the Middle East, also wants to establish a base to combat the Houthis. Somewhat of a necessity, given the Houthis' motto is, and I quote, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, and victory to Islam." They are not a subtle bunch, those Houthis. And again, they're less extreme than al-Shabaab. This Israel base effort, however, is thwarted by a lack of international recognition. Jerusalem Post 1024. These two groups have recently gotten into contact, and as may be obvious now, an al-Shabaab Houthi team-up would probably be pretty bad, at least for international shipping, if nothing else. Quote, Yemen-based Houthi militants have made contact with al-Shabaab. The officials fear it is a prelude to providing Somali militants with advanced weapons, such as armed drones, that might enable al-Shabaab to mount deadlier attacks on U.S. and allied positions in Somalia. That's Phillips 1024. Powerful ideologies hope to disrupt the liberal international order in the Horn of Africa. Somaliland can counter these forces, and it all starts with the African Union. This guy in the middle, though, I love this picture. This is an incredible picture. He looks like a guy you'd want on your team, but has no trigger discipline. So, piece of advice, from a middle-aged guy to some high school kids, if you're ever going to wage war on international shipping, at least practice good trigger discipline, at the very least. If you're terrorizing Middle Eastern straits, good trigger discipline. Let's end this section on international benefits with a much grander benefit, changing the meaning of statehood around the world and taking statehood out of the purview of the world's colonial powers. If colonialism was history's greatest evil, and that is a very easy case to make, then Somaliland represents a fundamental blow to the colonial notions and systems that remain in the world today. Quote, Somaliland statehood remains unrecognized by the AU because it is a case which defies Eurocentric frameworks of statehood. Westphalian notions of statehood are of limited use when applied to African states. A redefinition of statehood to appreciate different government forms would allow non-European states to be understood normatively. Thus, recognizing Somaliland is not just a diplomatic formality, it is an opportunity to reshape statehood and offer an inclusive international system. End quote. That is Aleli 24. And now, my friends, we negate recognition of Somaliland will destabilize the Somaliland itself, its mother country Somalia, and the greater Horn of Africa region. In addition, by fomenting secessionist movements, such recognition may sow chaos in countries around Africa and spur instability around the globe. In the meantime, AU recognition will be a boon to al-Shabaab, a radical Islamist group who is engaged in violent terrorism around Africa, and who are likely funneling arms to Sudan and may soon begin cooperating with the Houthis to ramp up their attacks. Although in such wide-breadth lectures, single arguments are rare, this is just such a case, and that argument is stability. Let's begin with the case study of Ethiopia's MOU in Somaliland. This recent agreement is the best indication we have of what the response to the Somaliland administration's recognition by the AU would look like. By analogy, think of Taiwan. Taiwan has never declared independence from China, but there are occasional indications in speeches, demonstrations of democracy like elections, and acts of statehood like diplomatic visits to and from Taiwan. All of these relatively minor acts infuriate Beijing to the point of staging major encirclement drills around the island. In fact, Taiwan was just this week surrounded by a staggering naval presence, the largest in decades. This all in response to the president stopping by Hawaii and Guam on a trip around Pacific Islands. Likewise, the response of various groups to the Ethiopian MOU, a document that hasn't been ratified, hasn't been released, a document we only have rumors about, should clue us into the hellscape that awaits us in a post-recognition world. Pictured here are Somali protests over the Ethiopian MOU. But before talking about international reactions, let's see what the evidence says about the northern Somalian territory itself, Somaliland, about the self-declared state of Somaliland. The Somaliland administration's stability after recognition might be thwarted or threatened by two mechanisms. First, the motivation for independence that has kept the region stable and peaceful for over 30 years, the motivation that causes the government to spend 60% of its budget on policing and security, after recognition, that motivation will be gone. Jeffrey 16. With the unifying power of the Quest gone, some worry it could suffer the sort of factionalism that tore through Somalia after it achieved its long-awaited independence and unification. South Sudan's descended in turmoil since independence is offered as illustrative of the potential fallout from a recognized Somaliland. End quote. With the motivation of international recognition gone, the spiritual impetus of northern Somalia may disappear as well. Second, although the various clans and factions in Somaliland's border have so far cooperated, recognition would increase the stakes for infighting. Gordon 23. As several observers have documented, non-recognition lowered the political spoils to be gained from violent competition, incentivizing cooperation between communities. End quote. The recent democratic change in leadership, for example, would be more difficult if it meant giving up control of an internationally legitimized country. Somalia's central government is the loudest voice opposed to the Somaliland administration's recognition. Recognizing would greatly harm Somalia's stability, so it makes sense that they'd be opposed. Pinto 224 on Somalia's recognition, a reaction to the Ethiopian MOU. Somalia called it a direct attack on its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The agreement openly defies the One Somalia policy and weakens Mogadishu's stabilization efforts. When you agree to legally steal a part of a country, what is stopping other parts of the country from splitting away as well? What legitimacy does that government retain after losing a major portion of its territory? If Texas seceded tomorrow, what would we think of Washington? This concept of territorial integrity is crucial to statehood itself, and recognition would destroy the territorial integrity of the nation of Somalia. And this isn't just an internal matter. Territorial integrity is a crucial value of the African Union itself. Quote, the African Union has retained its commitment to the unity and territorial integrity of member states. Since Somalia is an AU member, the admission of Somaliland would violate this fundamental principle. This is an issue that affects the status, the sovereign rights, and the integrity of a member state. This is not a routine matter. It is very sensitive. That is International Crisis Group 06. And indeed, territorial integrity is so fundamental that the US, EU, China, the Arab League have all called for Somalia's sovereignty to be respected as well. It's a VOA 124. The impact is conflict and war. Caleb Weiss is senior analyst at Bridgeway, MA in International Relations and Affairs. James Barnett is a research fellow at Hudson Institute where he studies conflict, terrorism, and geopolitics in Africa. Weiss and Barnett, 124. Should this brewing conflict persist, it will take the form of a multi-sided proxy conflict. Given the brittleness of both Somalia and Somaliland, as well as Ethiopia, which is presently fighting multiple large-scale insurgencies, this scenario is hardly more reassuring than the prospects of a conventional war. Shaking the stability of both Somalia proper, as well as its northern regions of Somaliland, is reasons enough to negate this resolution. But recognition would go even further. It would help to empower al-Shabaab. Weiss and Barnett, 124, on al-Shabaab's reaction to the Ethiopian MOU. Al-Shabaab has come out in strong opposition to the memorandum and implicitly threatened to attack Ethiopia and Somaliland over a deal that it says violates Somalia's sovereignty. Al-Shabaab's messaging also acts as a real challenge that complicates any plan of action meant to calm down regional tensions. Tensions seem likely to lead to the freezing of critical regional counterterrorism cooperation at a time when al-Shabaab is poised to profit from widespread Somali anger. End quote. Based on their own messaging and their own previous actions, we can be sure that recognition would spur widespread violence from the group. And there might be nobody to stop them. Somalia is currently supported by African Union peacekeeper troops, and Ethiopia's troops, some of the best trained and most experienced in Africa, cover 60% of Somalia's land. These troops are vital in the fight against al-Shabaab. Kind of weird, right? That Somalia's sworn enemy, Ethiopia, is effectively occupying it with troops, but Ethiopia can be a real good guy that way. Yet, even the MOU itself effectively halts the work of these Ethiopian peacekeepers, and thus any resistance to the radical terrorist group. Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, Somalia's current president, quote, says that if the MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland is not scrapped, Ethiopian peacekeepers must leave. America, in particular, does not want untested and diplomatically contentious Egyptian or Eritrean forces to replace them. That risks jeopardizing the mission altogether. There's a serious risk of a physical security vacuum open on the ground, which al-Shabaab can fill. End quote. The first impact, of course, is destabilizing Somalia. Al-Shabaab's stated goal is taking control of Somalia. Recognition, therefore, will help to create a radical jihadist government in the Horn of Africa. And don't hear this wrong. This isn't a politically unfriendly Muslim government like the Taliban or Islamic Republic of Iran. This is a group who genuinely wants to violently spread Sharia law to the four corners of the world. A group deeply opposed to the capital L liberal values you or I would consider civilized. Second impact is Sudan. Al-Shabaab and the Somali government itself is likely funneling Egyptian arms into Sudan, the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Rubin 1024 on weapons flowing to Sudan. This is cut a tad different from where it first appeared in this lecture. Quote, Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed prioritizes his own political survival over al-Shabaab's defeat, often allowing weapons to leak to the terrorists in order to weaken regional or political competitors. By providing the Somali government with weapons absent any controls, the Egyptian government essentially opens the floodgates. I've interviewed captured insurgents in both northern Mozambique and the DRC. Each talked of Somalia's al-Shabaab running weapons smuggling routes. The world's bloodiest conflict today is not in Ukraine or Gaza, but rather Sudan, where the Somali government can make millions by reselling its arms. End quote. The third impact is international spread. Again, Vice and Barnett, 124. Al-Shabaab publicly called for jihad against the memorandum's implementation. There remains a real concern that Al-Shabaab could expand its terror campaign internationally. As noted above, Al-Shabaab's leadership has openly called for jihad against the memorandum's implementation, which puts both Ethiopia and Somaliland within the group's crosshairs. End quote. So even rumors of the Ethiopian MOU, if implemented, could destabilize the Somaliland region and Somalia itself, while empowering al-Shabaab to recruit, funnel arms, and launch attacks. How much more violent and destabilizing would actual AU recognition be? Next, as we work our way up the chain, and no, not last, the Horn of Africa's regional stability would be threatened by recognition. Zooming out, we see the Egyptian-Ethiopian rivalry heating up in a world where the Somaliland region is recognized and Ethiopian benefits. Pjovic, 13, minces no words. Egypt was a staunch supporter of a Somali unity, a policy in line with its desires for a strong and unified Somalia, which may even one day reassert its claims over Somali-populated areas of Ethiopia, thereby adding to Egypt's leverage. Egypt's enthusiastic support for the interim rulers in Mogadishu has been matched by hostility towards Somaliland. End quote. And Pito, 224 on the recent MOU, Egypt sees the deal as an attempt by Addis Ababa to destabilize the region and assert its hegemony. Ethiopia's ambitions have also reignited old tensions with neighboring Eritrea, which has sought rapprochement with Mogadishu. Military responses to the MOU have come from both sides, from Egypt and Somalia. Mogadishu, in response to the MOU, signed a bilateral defense treaty with Egypt, along with strengthening military ties with Turkey. Cairo, for its part, has restarted weapons delivery to Somalia to act as a warning to Ethiopia. The implicit message is that the Egyptians can arm al-Shabaab against Ethiopia. No empty threat, given that al-Shabaab already has a foothold in the country. For example, part of the shipment to Somalia was anti-tank weapons, an otherwise strange shipment given that al-Shabaab or other groups the Somali government might fight don't field tanks. But you know who does have tanks? Ethiopia. Last on stability. The stability of the African continent itself is threatened by AU recognition. In response to the Ethiopian MOU and resulting chaos that we've just seen, quote, the African Union expressed concern and urged all parties to exercise restraint and de-escalate. After the recent wave of military coups, the organization fears the creation of yet another nexus of instability in the Horn of Africa, or the setting of a precedent for secessionist movement, end quote. Indeed, that's a major reason the AU hasn't yet recognized the Somaliland region, despite the pressure. Quote, the bloc has feared that formal recognition would embolden other secessionist movements on the continent, such as Nigeria's Biafra or Morocco's Western Sahara, to demand the same. That's Ferragamo and Klabustica 18. This issue of Western Sahara, by the way, is a little bit confusing. So if this lecture seems to have some contradictions, it probably does. I don't really understand what's going on. The AU recognizes or doesn't recognize Western Sahara. I don't know. Kenyan24 echoes these sentiments. There are, quote, broadly held fears within the African Union that formal recognition of Somaliland would set a precedent and could embolden secessionist movements across the continent. The problem for the AU is that there is a long queue of people who want recognition and a long queue of governments that don't want to recognize. End quote. And actually, finally, if Af can end with a quote about changing the face of statehood through Somaliland, so can Neg. Gulaid Yousaf Dan is a distinguished senior lecturer at universities in Somaliland, specializing in diplomacy, politics, and international relations in the Horn of Africa. He sees the ripple effects of recognition sowing instability beyond Africa. Many do see its recognition as legitimizing the cause of other separatist movements. States fear recognizing the state of Somaliland since it might be a precedent that will threaten their territorial integrity. It is common amongst those nations with strong separatist movements or great regionalism caused by large ethnic or cultural identity. For example, Spain with Catalonia in the Basque Country, China with Taiwan and Tibet, and Russia with several of its ethnic regions. The interest at stake for any strong state requires a hard line against an acknowledgement of new entities emerging from secessionist efforts. End quote. So, in short, if you want all but guaranteed global destruction, go ahead, vote AF. But if you prefer to keep the little piece this world has left, you have to vote Neg. Thanks for watching. Best luck on this topic, and please leave any questions in the comments. As always, remember to be kind to yourself and to the people around you. Merry Christmas, and I will see you all next time.